Good evening, everyone. Oh, that's maybe a little loud. Sorry. I'll talk about myself in just a moment. I'm clearly not Father Andre. But let's begin with prayer. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. If you wish to follow along, it's the opening prayer on the front page of your binders. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, conscious of our sinfulness, but aware that we gather in your name. Come to us. Remain with us and enlighten our hearts. Give us light and strength to know your will, to make it our own, and to live it in our lives. Guide us by your wisdom, support us by your power, for you are God, sharing the glory of Father and Son. You desire justice for all. Enable us to uphold the rights of others. Do not allow us to be misled by ignorance or corrupted by fear or favor. Unite us to yourself in the bond of love and keep us faithful to all that is true. As we gather in your name, may we temper justice with love so that our decisions may be pleasing to you and earn the reward promised to good and faithful servants. You live and reign with the Father and the Son, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, well, welcome. I'm Dr. Brendan McInerney. I've been a parishioner here at St. Therese for the last few years. I'm a teacher at Holy Family Catholic High School out in Victoria. Before that, I lived in New York while I was getting my PhD in systematic theology. So I have a little bit of a background in these things. I foolishly, maybe inspiration, I don't know. I volunteered to do this. Last year, I know that Father was working with you all on like a church history course, and I kept on hearing about it, and I thought, that just sounds so much fun. Like, I want to be involved in something like that. So I approached Father, and he said, "Oh, that's great. What would you want to do?" And I thought, well, maybe we could do something on the Second Vatican Council. And he said, sure. And so that's where this came from. Hopefully it's educational. Hopefully it's enjoyable. Hopefully you have time to build community and speak together and grow together in your faith and all of our faiths. Before we get into the nitty-gritty and sort of introducing and giving an overview of what happened at the council or the lead up to the council, we're supposed to go over the small group guidelines. So if you just want to look at that. I know most of you are veterans, you're pros at this, but it's always a good idea to remind yourself and ourselves of what we're looking for here. So, as mentioned, small groups are an opportunity to create deep and lasting faith-filled relationships with people who will share times of joy in your life and encourage and help you in times of difficulty. I know it says this later on at another point, but be praying for each other, be thinking of each other, hold each other in your hearts. So number one, pretty simple, straightforward. Please arrive on time and come prepared. If you're not going to make it, please let somebody else know, someone in your small group, just so everyone's kind of on the same page and aware of what's going on. As mentioned, you can decide how to lead your small group discussion. You can have a designated leader. You can rotate that leadership. Makes no difference. But someone who can kind of keep things on track and keep things moving along. I try to explain to my high school students that class is much more fun when more people participate. I think it's the same thing in small group discussions. If you're a really chatty person and you've got a lot on your mind and you've got a lot to say that you really want to say, maybe dial it back a little bit. Maybe choose, as mentioned, a few things, 3 things that, maybe make a little list for yourself. These are the things that I really would like to say, and then hold yourself back. If, on the other hand, you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, this is definitely how I am in all small group settings, I don't say anything at all until the last minute. I have like one thought, and then I hold it the whole time, and it drives my wife crazy. I mean, we'll sit there in like a group discussion and say, well, why isn't Brendan saying anything? Why isn't he saying anything? Because I didn't write down ahead of time 2 things that I really wanted to say. So maybe write the notes for yourself to kind of keep yourself in the game, ready to jump in. I don't think anyone's going to ask you to, stand up and defend yourself or something like that in front of a large crowd. You're sharing your thoughts, so maybe come prepared with a few thoughts. And then if someone strays from the topic, which could happen, hypothetically it could happen, a gentle nudge back to the topic at hand is very nice. But make sure it's gentle. Make sure it's gentle. We don't need hurt feelings and offense being taken or anything like that. Be a good listener. I think as a general rule, listen or engage and speak and have a conversation to learn, so that you're listening first and foremost, rather than just waiting to throw your 2 cents in there or have your takedown. I don't know why you'd have a takedown, but if you're just waiting for them to shut up so that you can jump in, try to change the mindset so that you're listening to learn from them. And then, of course, no side conversations and small group discussions as much as possible. That should be avoided. Stick to the assigned material. Do not bring other materials to the small group. You want to go with the things that you all have been reading together. There are some things that I would encourage you to check out. In a little bit, we'll talk about where you can find some of the documents from the Second Vatican Council. Those things can be really good, but don't, another book or something like that you've read that someone else hasn't read. It's almost unfair in that situation. Just stick with the material. The material's pretty good. I think it will provide a lot of light and opportunity for discussion. So if you can just stick with Reclaiming Vatican II, the blue book that many of you have on you right now, and your study binder. Again, other materials, you can leave them aside. Maybe you can talk about them outside of small group or something. Small group discussions are confidential. Just, people will be sharing their thoughts and experiences, and the Second Vatican Council is a topic of considerable controversy, and it has been since before the Second Vatican Council was actually held. So people might have very strong opinions and feelings about it. As always, be respectful when you're sharing your view. But yeah, we keep it confidential so that people can feel safe, that they can be honest with their opinion, their experience, their impression of things. And remember, we have to have patience sometimes with others. We have to have patience with ourselves. So if there's, tension, or if someone's kind of under your skin one week or something like that, give it time. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe you're having a bad day. Maybe you didn't eat enough for dinner or something like that, and it's actually just hunger that's causing this discomfort. I have little daughters, and that's 9 times out of 10. It's because they haven't eaten, so when they're impatient and angry. So if you're feeling a little impatience, maybe pray on it. Maybe rededicate yourself to patience and to understanding. And again, pray for your small group members. The idea here, not just to learn, but to grow again in community, and part of that community is sort of lives in the Spirit, and that means prayer for one another. That means being aware of the burdens that people share. That means being aware of the joys that they're sharing, and pray on those things. Rejoice when they rejoice, lament when they lament. Okay. When you begin each session, your small group, I know you guys are pros at this. I'm the rookie here. Please begin with prayer, and maybe open up to people offering their own personal intercessions. Okay. We can flip over to the next slide, I think. As mentioned, the goals of the study: to know each other, pray for each other, love God's word, and have some fun. I hope that it's interesting learning about the Second Vatican Council. I hope that it's illuminating. Again, it's controversial, and it has been for decades. And I'm hoping that by the end of it, you can kind of see, both in the book and then also in what I'll be sharing, that there was a tremendous need for the Second Vatican Council. There was a genuine need for it. But that what the Second Vatican Council was aiming at was not to, throw out the baby with the bathwater or anything like that, but was aiming at a renewal within the church. And I'm hoping that approaching this prayerfully with one another, having fun with it, learning, that we can sort of appreciate how the Second Vatican Council concludes in some ways, putting this at our feet, waiting for us to pick this up and carry on what it sought, what it was looking for, carry on its work in some sense. We've already gone over small group guidelines. Evidently, I'm doing this out of order. The structure of each session, as you can see, you'll begin with small group discussion time. You'll have 45 minutes of that. Prayer, sharing a little bit about how things have been going from the past week for you, highs from the past week. That could go on forever. So as Father mentions, try to keep it to about 5 minutes. Discussion, reflection questions, you'll be getting those in advance of the next week so that while you're reading, you can prepare a little bit. You can be thinking a little bit about what you're reading from Father Blake Britton. Share your prayer intentions, a closing prayer, then you'll have a nice 15-minute break. Then we'll switch over to the large group teaching. I'll do my thing. I'll probably wander around a little bit, using my hands a lot, gesturing, because that's how I teach. And then we'll have some question and answer time. So, and then we're probably out of here by 8:30. Hopefully I know you're going to have good questions. Hopefully you share those questions. Hopefully I can provide quality answers for you. So structure of, it's really just the fall for us here going into December. It's roughly one chapter each week. This is sort of a peculiar one where we kind of lump together what was really introductory chapters. And then after that, it's kind of a march through the 4 major documents of the Second Vatican Council. We'll be saying them over and over again, so you're going to have these memorized off the top of your head. Sacrosanctum Concilium, Lumen Gentium, Dei Verbum, and Gaudium et Spes. And then when I'm doing my thing, at least Father maybe remembered me saying this, I'm going to bring in a few of the smaller documents, because some of those smaller documents were a source of major controversy in themselves in their own rights, even though that they're not like one of these big 4 documents, the 4 what are called constitutions, and then there were decrees and declarations and things like that. But some of them are really important, like the decree on religious liberty and things along those lines. So I'll bring those in when I think it's relevant, to just sort of like fill in the picture of what was going on at the council and the debates that were being held. Reclaiming Vatican II, I'll say maybe a little bit more about this. I might as well say it now. Father Blake Britton, I think it's a good book because I think it's really understandable. I think it's accessible. I had picked another book, to be totally honest, and Ms. Lammers read it, and she said, "This is so incredibly dry. This isn't any good." And so we changed it up. I'm pleased that we went with this one because I think, again, his is much more accessible. He's a little bit more entertaining as an author. There's a little bit more energy. I chose some stuffy English theology professor. His take, and will be very clear as you're reading. He wants to present the Second Vatican Council as a continuation, a development, a natural development of the tradition of the Church. And the reason why that's his argument and why he even has to make that argument is because as he sees it, and I think this is generally fair, as he sees it, there are people both within the Catholic Church and outside the Catholic Church that see the Second Vatican Council as a rupture. That things were going in a certain way, and then the Second Vatican Council happened, and now everything's going in a totally different direction. There are some people, and he refers to them as traditionalists. Some of them are inside the church, some of them are outside the church, who say that this change in direction, this complete and total change in direction, is illegitimate and wrong. It was a mistake. It was an error. And then there are others, and he labels them progressives, and they're, again, inside and outside. As he sees it, they make the same claim, only the change in direction is absolutely necessary. It was totally necessary, and we should keep it up. And he's trying to suggest, and I think his spirit, his intention is sound here, that that's not It's not a very helpful way to read the text of the Second Vatican Council. It's not a very helpful way to go about even just managing a church. And that, in fact, what the Second Vatican Council is about is renewal within tradition. It's renewal within tradition. It's not rupture. It's not something else. I think that his strength is that he's very charitable to the group that he calls the traditionalists. I would say that it's clear, at least to me, it's clear that his audience includes people, or his imagined audience anyway, includes people who are in that realm. And so he's working really hard to convince those that, no, this is all good. Because of that, I think he does have a slight weakness, and I hope to make it clear, at least where I think some of the weakness lies when I'm walking through this, in that he doesn't really do a great job of explaining, well, why did Pope St. John the 23rd think a council was a good thing to call in the first place? And so I'm going to address some of those things while we're together. You can, of course, read Father Britton and totally disagree with him. You can totally disagree with me. No skin off my back. That's totally fine. That's just my reading of it. And so I just want you to be aware of that. Okay. We'll meet roughly every other week, roughly bi-weekly. You can see the dates there, September 20th, October 4th, October 18th, and then we've got a little bit of a gap, almost like a month gap, and then we'll pick back up in November 15th, 29th, and then we'll end on December 6th. And so we'll go into Advent, and we'll be well prepared for celebrating the birth of Christ, and we'll have a sense of renewal, and everything will be great and grand. Okay. Couple more things before we take a little break and then we come back and do this. You can see here a few links to the various texts from the Second Vatican Council, the major ones anyway. As I mentioned before, the four constitutions, Sacrosanctum Concilium on the sacred liturgy, Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, Dei Verbum, the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, and then Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. If you're not going to read, I mean, you don't have to read any of it, but if you're going to read things from the Second Vatican Council, this is where I would start. You can get into those decrees and declarations and some of the smaller matters down the road, but these are sort of like the pillars of the council. So if you want to kind of know what the council was saying in its own words, that's where you'd want to go. They can all be found on the Vatican website, in their own sort of official translation. And then you can see, even if you were to type in one of those links, it would take you to something that looks a little bit like the following page, where all of the declarations and decrees and constitutions are listed. If you were studying, I don't know, Belarusian or something like that, you could read it in Belarusian if you wanted, or some other language other than English. I know sometimes I do that for fun. The Vatican website is www.vatican.va. You can see it there on the links listed. I will warn you, though, and I only know this because I go to the Vatican website quite a bit for work, that in certain Wi-Fi networks with maybe high security settings or something like that, if you just type in www.vatican.va and hit enter, it will say something like, you can't reach this site. In which case, if that happens to you, I highly recommend just doing a Google search for the Vatican. And then the first option is going to be the website, and you can just search in their website. There's like a little search option. Just put in Second Vatican Council and something will come up. You'll get there, more or less. I wish you luck. Godspeed with that. We also have included, if diving into those documents, if that's just not what you're interested in doing at this moment in your life, because you don't have time to read 50 pages of conciliar texts, we do have this overview from the Episcopal Commission for Doctrine of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, so our neighbors to the north, put together a nice little overview of the Second Vatican Council, sort of introductory material. What was the council? their sort of take. Why did it come about? The various documents and things like that. So if you're just looking for a sort of appetizer, this is where you'd want to go. This could be very helpful. And I just glancing over it now, I think it's quite good. It kind of covers all of the basics. Okay. Let's see. Any questions at this one? Yes.
So in the book, does he address the documents? Does he put some of the text from the documents?
Yes.
In the book?
Yes.
So we don't have to go to the documents, or should we be going to the documents too?
That's a very good question. I would say, so he does, I think, a pretty good job of summarizing the document. Not necessarily step by step, but providing the teaching of the document, what it said and what it didn't say. He's really concerned about what it didn't say. And so there's some clarifying that he does there. I guess I would recommend, because reading this book, I've already read those documents. That's sort of already in my mind. So I didn't at any point find a need for him to spell out what he's talking about. But if you're in that situation, I highly recommend go check out the document. He'll even, when he's talking about a particular issue, he'll even mention what paragraphs it's in. So it's pretty easy for you to go and find the text itself. And in,
You don't have to read all of it.
No. I think that would be excessive. Yeah, that would be, you don't have to if you don't want to. If you do want to, my hat's off to you, but you don't have to. Yeah. This was maybe part of the problem of the original book that I chose, that it's just boring. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
Also, sorry, I have another question.
No, that's fine.
I was looking at the meeting dates, and it talks about September 20th being chapters 1 and 2, as if we've read them already, or is this for next week?
Right. So we're going to sort of introduce and set things up, and then the hope is that you can read chapters 1 and 2 going into the next session.
For next time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it almost makes it look like.
Right. Like you should have already done it.
Book today.
Correct. Right. That would be very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have 15 minutes though, so I mean, who knows what you can get done. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's take a 15-minute break. There's water and cookies and hot water and maybe coffee, maybe just hot water, and tea. You're free to help yourself. You can use the bathroom, chat, whatever you want to do. Come ask me more questions if you've got them. Yeah, thank you. Right, and then we'll come back and we'll get into some material. Yeah, so I'll just address this now. I think everyone's here, just about. Just want to give you a quick sort of big picture introduction to what the Second Vatican Council was, and a little bit behind why it came to be. We're going to talk a little bit about Pope St. John the 23rd. We're going to talk briefly about Pope St. Paul VI, two saint popes who sort of ushered the Vatican Council through its steps. And then after that, you'll have a little bit of time to meet with your small group and kind of chat and sort of see where you're at and get ready for it, okay? So just because we want to make sure that you remember those dates, I think this is the fifth time that you're seeing them now, okay? Okay, so Reclaiming Vatican II by Father Blake Britton. This sort of goes along with the introduction, chapters 1 and 2 of the book. This might be a little bit difficult. You're going to want to read those chapters before you dive into chapter 3, which is really the subject for our next, for the next one. Chapter 3 is on Sacrosanctum Concilium, and that's going to be the next meeting. So, yeah, you're going to have to kind of play catch up here a little bit. Father found this. I haven't had a chance really to look into it, but Father, I think, has impeccable taste. Father Felix Just provides an overview of the Second Vatican Council. Another good place to check if you want to write that down. We can maybe come back to this slide, so you can write it down later if you'd like.
Will the slides be on the parish website?
Yes, they will be on the parish website. Thank you for that reminder. Okay, before you sort of like jump straight to calling of the council and things like that, it's really helpful to think about what happened with the church in Europe going all the way back to even before the 19th century. Historians, secular historians talking about European history refer to what they call the long 19th century, going from the beginning of the French Revolution and ending with the beginning of the First World War. In some ways, the Catholic Church had its own longer 19th century, starting with the French Revolution and really only ending with the Second World War. Because what happened in the course of just before the 19th century, through the 19th century and beyond, was just a series of what the church could only experience as assaults. First with the French Revolution, beginning in 1789, and the severe persecution of the church in that country. Of course, a lot of that was based on the reaction to the corruption of the church, the sort of collusion between people of power in the church and the monarchy. And so if the monarchy is going to go, the church is going to go too. But that experience of this, rejection of the church, martyrdoms left and right, and this being linked with this call to, liberty, fraternity, equality, there's no really better way of putting it, but it put a sour taste in the mouth of the church. That when people start taking an interest in liberty, democracy, things like that, at least in the 19th century, for the church that meant they are coming for us. Because that's exactly what happened. After the French Revolution, after Napoleon Bonaparte took power, Napoleon was in some ways a little bit more favorable to the church, but it was favors on his terms, and to get those terms, he kidnapped 2 popes in order to make his deals and make his agreements and be crowned emperor and so forth. After the fall of Napoleon in 1815, it's only a short time later that some European countries have another set of revolutions in 1830, and then again in 1848. Anytime there's a revolution in Europe, at this time, again, they're coming for the church. They are coming for the bishops. They're going after priests. That's what that meant. You had the unification of Germany and under Otto von Bismarck and what's called the Kulturkampf. Bismarck wanted to break the power of the church in Germany and any territory that the Kingdom of Prussia acquired and that what becomes the German Empire has. The church had to be sort of brought low. it had to be subservient as much as possible. And so Catholics in those countries were not able to run their own schools without interference. They were not able to sort of pursue their own agendas outside of, again, Bismarck and the sort of German Empire's dream. In Italy, we have the unification of Italy, and the small little kingdoms and principalities of Italy are coalescing together. And what that meant for the church, for the Pope in particular, was that the papal states were no more. The Pope was, as the Pope saw it, and as popes said it, they were prisoners in the Vatican, that their temporal power stopped once you sort of stepped outside. If you've seen the Vatican, you know, those great big colonnades outside St. Peter's. The moment he stepped beyond that, his power was gone. He had no more authority, at least no more earthly authority on the other side of that boundary. And so for many, many, many decades, the popes did not leave Vatican City. They didn't travel. They didn't even go into their own diocese of the whole city of Rome. You also have intellectual movements. You have the emergence of full-throated atheism. You had the rise of laissez-faire capitalist economics. It should be capitalist economics, not capitalism economics. And rather than, we don't want to get into like a political economic debate or something like that. But at the time, think of like the robber barons, think of the Gilded Age, think of child labor, things like that. You have the rise of Marxism, nationalism, and then that sort of morphs into totalitarianism of the Nazi kind and the Soviet kind. In that time, you have 2 world wars, and then after the world wars, you have the threat of nuclear war. The church, naturally, in this state, responded with, you can almost go down the line and you can find the direct response to all of these things in a papal document from the 19th century. You can find condemnations of democracy, of religious liberty, because religious liberty was being used as a slogan to destroy the church or like attack the church. You can find your condemnations or rejections of laissez-faire capitalism in the social encyclicals, particularly like Rerum Novarum, if you're familiar. You can find the rejection of violent Marxism, socialism in similar documents. You can find the condemnation of totalitarianism in documents from the 1930s. So down the line, the church was sort of like, it had its dukes up. It was going to defend itself, and so that's what it was trying to do. After the Second World War, with this sort of looming threat of nuclear war, there's a moment, I think, where the church sort of says, we need to do something other than just defend ourselves and sort of build up the fortress of faith. We need to sort of reach out to the modern world that has just gone through this extraordinary disaster with so much death and destruction, and now what is morphing into what we call the Cold War, but at that time, a possibility of another hot war between the West and the Soviets. And that this situation cannot stay. We have to do something. And so there was this desire within the church to respond to this situation, to the situation of the modern world. And when Pope Pius XII died, the pope that sort of ushered us through the Second World War, when he died in 1958, it was this moment of opportunity for something different. Pope Pius XII, Venerable Pope Pius XII, was an extraordinary figure, but he was not the figure who was going to make a change in approach or anything. And so they gathered together and elected, at that conclave, they elected Pope John the 23rd, affectionately referred to in his day as Good Pope John. He was an incredibly gregarious individual. He clearly loved to be with people, around people. A little bit about him. So he was actually born in a farm family. He was like a farm kid. ordained in 1904 and went on to further study and get a degree in canon law. He served with some sort of higher ups in the Italian church, served as a secretary of a bishop, seminary professor, and then during World War I, he was drafted into the army, served as in the medical corps. And then after that First World War, he went into the Vatican diplomatic services. And this is a key development in his life because he was sent east. He was sent to Bulgaria, and then later Turkey, Greece, and then he came back briefly to France during Reconstruction after the Second World War. But that experience in Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece was formative because it meant that he met Christians who were not Catholic, the Eastern Orthodox, East Greek Orthodox Christians when he was in Greece. In Turkey, he was dealing with a majority Muslim population and dealings with Muslims. And then when he was in Greece during the Second World War, he was also instrumental in getting Jews out of Europe, getting Jews away from, to escape the Holocaust. So he had experiences with Muslims, Jews, and then non-Catholic Christians in the Eastern Orthodox. And it's going to be big. That's going to play a role in the Second Vatican Council. He was elected Pope on October 28th, 1958. He was, as it says, 77. He says that the inspiration to call the council came to him in just a flash. That he didn't, when he was elected Pope, he wasn't thinking, the first thing I'm going to do is hold a council. He says that it came to him in a flash, and less than 3 months after his election, he announced this desire. He saw the council, and he speaks about it over and over again in the years between his announcement in 1959 and when it commenced. He spoke about it over and over again as a new Pentecost. If you think about that scene in Acts of the Apostles, where you've got the apostles, and they're scared. Jesus is ascended into heaven. It's days later. They're gathered in this upper room in Jerusalem during the Jewish Festival of Weeks, and they don't know what to do. They're hiding out. But the Holy Spirit descends on them, and what do? They go immediately out into the street, and they are preaching the resurrection of Christ, and they're being understood in the tongues of these Jews from all over the world. So he uses that image, I think, very, very deliberately, that the Second Vatican Council is going to be a new Pentecost. The church is going to shift in its outlook. It's going to shift from being sort of on the defensive to now going out into the world so that it can preach the gospel, so that it can preach the good news. We'll talk about that over and over again as we go on. He was, as I said, he was very gregarious, and people just really loved Pope John the 23rd. He was the first pope, I might be skipping ahead in a slide, this might be elsewhere, but he was the first pope in about 100 years to actually go and walk around in pastoral visits in the city of Rome itself. The previous pope who had done that, it was Blessed Pius IX. Since then, doing it. But John the 23rd started doing it again. And apparently, this is a little story, that as he was walking the streets of Rome after he was elected, a woman passed and said to her friend, probably under her breath, "My God, he's so fat." Because he looked like he enjoyed a good meal. And he says, "Madam, I trust you understand that the papal conclave is not exactly a beauty contest." Or like this other one I really love. It often happens that I wake up at night and begin to think about the serious problems afflicting the world, and I tell myself, I must talk to the Pope about it. Then the next day when I wake up, I remember that I am the Pope. He was, very jovial. Almost every picture you see of him, he's smiling. He was a very joyful person. As mentioned, he wanted the church to be less sort of inward-looking, less on the defensive, and more outward moving. Go out into the world, actively engage modern men and women, even those who disagree, even those who aren't in the church, because the church is meant to have them too. Though they are meant to come into the church also. And he sort of like broke this down a number of different ways, what he saw the council as being sort of tasked with, or the purpose of the council. And it sort of breaks down into a couple of different categories. The first category, and you'll read this in Britain, this is sort of like the buzzword about the Second Vatican Council, aggiornamento. Aggiornamento. It's an Italian word meaning like bringing up to date. He wanted the church to be more up to date. Not in the sense of changing its doctrines or anything like that, but speaking in a way that people who had been long estranged from the church could understand what she was saying. So that's what aggiornamento is all about, up to date, bringing up to date. Right? Meet modern men and women where they are in their language, because they're not going to learn ours. The next idea is a French term, ressourcement, which, as it says, they're return to the sources. There was an academic movement, a theological academic movement in the works before the Second Vatican Council that saw great fruit or great potential by returning to the study of Scripture, recentering Scripture in like the theological vision of the church. It had been a little bit sidelined over the course of the years because, of course, for a church that's sort of on the defensive, taking a keen interest in Scripture sounds maybe a little bit suspicious, like you don't care enough about the authority of the bishops or something like that, which of course that's not how it works, but that was kind of the mindset. And then returning and studying the theology. Thomas Aquinas is like the big name in theology in the 19th century and early 20th century. And Thomas Aquinas, of course, is like a towering genius from the medieval period. But what ressourcement was about was to recognize that Thomas Aquinas didn't come out of he didn't just like fall from the sky, that he was reading other people, earlier figures, people like Augustine, people like St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Basil the Great, St. Athanasius, the people who were behind those great councils in the early church period. Ressourcement was about trying to rediscover what they were saying. Because if you could rediscover and sort of re-encounter that, there was also a way to re-encounter Christ, sort of in a fresh way, in a way that wasn't sort of dominated by what's called neo-scholasticism. And then, of course, to defend and just further advance the truth of the faith. He comes back to that. There are some additional purposes, and we'll touch on those too. He said very clearly that he didn't want this council to gather so that the bishops could get together and debate finer points of theology, hair split, things like that. He wanted a more general renewal. He wanted to change the way the truth was presented, not change the truth of faith. I think he had a wisdom that modern men and women just like sort of saying it again over and over in the same way wasn't bringing people into the church, wasn't going to touch hearts. Instead, the church had to change, change its game to a certain extent. Again, changing new ways to show church teaching. Again, not altering the teaching, but simply changing the presentation, seeing it from a fresh angle, presenting it from a fresh angle. So he declared his intention to hold an ecumenical council in January 25th, 1959. For the logistics people, this is kind of interesting, I think. From 1959, shortly after he announced it, so from spring 1959 to spring 1960, was what was referred to as the Preparatory Period. Before they could hold a council, because Pope John didn't say, this is what we have to talk about, they sent out surveys and questionnaires to the bishops of the world, the theological faculties in the various universities, male superiors of religious orders. And they said, hey, we're going to hold a council. What's on your mind? What do you think would be important to talk about and work on at this council? And I don't have the exact number, but they got like a 75% response rate or something like that, which for when you're talking about like 3,000 plus people, that's pretty good. And what's sort of funny, as I understand, and you apparently you can go and actually see this whole collection of all of the responses. Like you can, those that has been published. I don't know who would have that around here, but somewhere out there, they're out there. And apparently, a lot of the bishops really had no idea what to do with it. They didn't know, and honestly, no one had ever asked them what they thought the church should be talking about, which is something that's going to come up in a few weeks when we talk about the document on the church. And so they got a lot of sort of all over the place. But in general, they were able to kind of gather all of this and break it down. And then they were able to move into, in the summer of 1960, the Preparatory Period. And they took all of those responses and they organized it according to sort of 10, with a secret 11th, sort of topic areas. And that went into what are called Preparatory Commissions. Groups of people who worked at the Vatican, people like cardinals and other people within those, what are called the Curia offices, the Curia being well, not just the cardinals, but the Curia being like the offices and bureaucracy that helps and assists the Pope, right? Those guys, they took over this preparatory work. Each one of these commissions was headed by the head of the corresponding curial office. So, for instance, Cardinal Ottaviani, he was the head of what we now call the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If you're not aware of these things, we can talk later. This is what Joseph Ratzinger was head of before he became Pope Benedict XVI. Ottaviani got to be in charge, because he was the head of that curial department. He was in charge on the Faith and Revelation Commission. So he got to sort of lead the work of preparing things. And what they prepared are called schema. Basically, draft documents. This is what you bishops wanted to talk about. This is what we think, as the Preparatory Commission, we should say about faith and revelation, or about the church, or about the liturgy and sacraments. And basically getting ready so that they have something to work with, right? Because you don't want to hold a meeting and then have everyone say, well, what are we doing here? So they had documents, they were ready to go. John, the 23rd, opened the council on October 11th, 1962. The people who gathered for the council some of them were enthusiastic. Some of them were very kind of nervous and suspicious, to be honest, about what was going to happen. John the 23rd's opening address sort of put some people at ease. He wanted this renewal to take place, that the church be filled with hope and faith. He was not interested in what he called the prophets of gloom, that the modern world is horribly lost and we would be better just to cut ourselves off from it. He wanted to see this desire of a deeper embrace of doctrine and tradition for the sake of renewal, right? Risorgimento and aggiornamento, those themes come out again. He did not want to see a series of condemnations, or what we refer to up here, anathemas. Most other councils, I think all other major councils in the history of the Catholic Church are usually occasioned by some sort of specific crisis or perceived error. And so one of the results of those councils is to condemn those errors. John the 23rd didn't want that for the Second Vatican Council. He did not want condemnation. He wanted sort of a positive, not a negative statement or series of statements about the faith. And then he also came back to this final point, which, again, remember, he had experience with non-Catholic Christians when he was in Greece. He wanted greater unity with Christians separated from the Catholic Church. What we call ecumenism was a major, major priority of his, that Catholics, and in particular Orthodox, but also Protestant Christians, might begin a slow process to being one again. And then he also wanted to reach out to the men and women all over the world who lived in, fear of nuclear disaster, or who lived in poverty and so forth. He wanted to reach out to others as well as non-Christian religions. We will see, again, all of that in the documents. So he opened it in joy. I'm going to jump ahead, actually. This is actually sort of interesting. All the documents were written in Latin, and in their sort of major gatherings, all the speeches given by the bishops were also done in Latin. This proved to be incredibly difficult for some bishops, particularly from the United States. Apparently, I've got stories. I don't need to bore you with the stories. This is a picture of, this is either the opening session or the closing session. They had to like reorganize St. Peter's Basilica. They had to put in bathrooms. They put in coffee bars, because if they're all gathered here, they're going to want to get a cup of coffee. And apparently John the 23rd, again, he had a kind of wisdom about him. He wanted people to bump into each other at the coffee bar and have like their little side chats, because he knew this is how things can happen. This is how things can, a little conversation there can find its way into a document later. He wanted that sort of interpersonal connection. Just to give a sense of the size. So there were about 2,900 official, what we call council fathers at the Second Vatican Council. Usually, like once the sessions got going, like once they actually got going in the meetings, there were really probably around 2,200 or so at any given time. There were some who were not able to go because their governments wouldn't let them go, like those living behind the Iron Curtain. They weren't allowed in many instances. On top of the Council Fathers, you had a group referred to as the Periti. The Periti were the theological experts, theologians, philosophers, things like that. Joseph Ratzinger was one of these Periti. A bishop could bring his own guy, and they were all men. A bishop could bring their own guy, and then there were a few official Periti that were designated by the church. But Joseph Ratzinger is probably the most famous. There are others. On top of the Periti, there were observers, people who were invited from non-Catholic churches and religions, were invited to come and watch the unfoldings in the sort of general sessions. Auditors, these were lay people. By the end of the council, 2 of whom were women, who were invited to listen and in certain scenarios offer feedback and things like that. And then there was press. There was a lot of press. This was big news. So this was pretty well covered. This is kind of amazing to think of, but it is perhaps the largest organized meeting in human history. That certainly there are larger gatherings of people, but a meeting that has rules and organization and parliamentary procedure and all of that, this was probably the largest one ever. It issued no condemnations. There was no single or specific cause, crisis, or heresy. There were no Arians denying the divinity of Jesus running around. There were no Protestants, causing various troubles for the Catholic Church, and really no grave abuses. Again, it came to him suddenly in a flash. Okay. We're not going to get into all. We've already said a lot of this. Christian doctrine should be guarded and taught more efficaciously. Should never depart from the sacred patrimony, resource small, but she must look to the present aggiornamento. This is the problem with this. There's sort of 2 hands in the presentation. I have some things, Father had some things, and there's a little bit of overlap. Promote the unity of Christians, again, incredibly important to him. That was near his heart, dear to him. And then address modern needs. Okay. There were 4 sessions, beginning in the fall of 1962, and then occurring each fall after that. So fall of 1962, fall of 1963, 64, 65. What's really crazy to think about is after the first session, Pope John the 23rd died. So they had to hold a conclave as well as do all of this council work. Pope Paul VI was elected. Pope Paul VI was a friend of John the 23rd. He was Archbishop of Milan. Very different personality, though they were friends. Paul VI was much more introverted, much quieter. He was capable, as it says, capable of deep and enduring friendship like his with John the 23rd. But yeah, much less gregarious, much less jovial. Paul VI, John the 23rd's philosophy about things was, my job is to get it going, and then I'm going to step away. And so he would just watch the council proceedings from a TV. like in the papal apartments. He did not want to be a physical presence at the council. Paul VI was a little bit different. Paul VI makes a few interventions here and there. He's a little bit more active. He didn't speak from the council floor or anything like that, or really interfere in the voting and things like that, but there were a few things that he engaged in. And while the council was going on, he had his own stuff. So he, for instance, established the retirement age at 75 for bishops. Cardinals over the age of 80 could not hold a curial office or vote in the conclave. He began the tradition of popes visiting the church throughout the world. So he visited the United States as well as a number of other countries. I believe India was one of them. The first session produced no text. They got together, the Preparatory Commissions presented the schema, and then the bishops said, after the Preparatory Commissions handed off work to the council was then to establish its own commissions in these areas, with the presumption that the head of the Preparatory Commission would be the head of the new Conciliar Commission, right? If this is the guy who's been leading this stuff and doing all this drafting, it just makes perfect sense to keep him in charge. But what happened, in the very first day of the council, is that a group of bishops, cardinal archbishops, said, who were not themselves of the Curia, they said, we don't really like that idea. We want to re-vote for who's going to be on these commissions and who's going to be heading them. And the Preparatory Commission people, they couldn't do anything about that. The Curia couldn't do anything about that. But this moment was this sort of extraordinary event that the bishops said, no, we want to get to know one another. We want to figure out who would really be good in these places. And sort of they kind of flexed their collective muscle a little bit and sort of set everything on a new course. So that first session just kind of got the ball rolling. It got the debates going. It got some draft work done, but it wasn't until the second, third, and fourth session that the documents were actually issued, promulgated, as we would say. The major ones, the first major document that was released is, in fact, the first one we're going to talk about, Sacrosanctum Concilium on the liturgy. And the liturgy is, the meaning of the liturgy, the nature of the liturgy, proposed reforms for the liturgy, why the reforms are necessary. These constitutions then sort of flow from there in the third and then the final session. Again, these are these pillar documents. This is where the church, the bishops gathered together. I mean, think about that. 2,900 of them, give or take, 2,200 of them, give or take. That's a lot of people talking about these things, voting on these things. These documents, these four constitutions are really kind of the heart of what the universal church in the 1960s wanted to say. Again, Sacrosanctum Concilium on the liturgy. Here's a diagram. I'm not totally sure what to make of it. Sacrosanctum Concilium and Dei Verbum, sort of the foundation, and then from that flows the document on the church in the modern world, and then the various decrees. A lot of the decrees are going to touch on things that show up in those larger documents. So I'm going to I'll highlight as we go along in our subsequent gatherings. Sacrosanctum Concilium on the liturgy, Lumen Gentium, the church, Dei Verbum on divine revelation, and Gaudium et Spes. Or, as I think, this is all redundant. This is what you'll have in your book. In fact, you could find that on page 35. I like the way that Britain visualizes it, that the council begins with liturgy because liturgy is sort of the most interior dimension or the most interior activity of the church. It's where the church sort of behaves in the most churchy way. And it's from the liturgy that then the ideas and the teachings of the church will come in the next documents. And then the church sort of goes out into the world bearing the fruit of divine revelation. And then finally, it carries that out into the evangelical work in the world, right? To address its needs, to to call it into herself. I noticed he shared with me, Father shared with me, the slides of a few of the church history ones. And I just could not believe how much photoshopping he did to get those dog and cat faces on everything. So the message of the council, and we'll see this over and over again, is at least for us, I think, as lay people, to be the church in the world, to carry the church out, to bear the good news for people who do not hear it or do not yet have it. And so that theme of evangelizing will come out a lot. And so you want to be apparently like that golden retriever puppy and not the grumpy cat. Okay. I think we have a few moments for questions, and then you'll have a little chance for small group stuff. Any questions at this point? There was a lot there. We had to move pretty quickly, but hopefully it's making a little bit of sense. Yes?
I might have missed, but how long would they meet each time, each fall?
Oh, yeah, good question. So it was usually from October, the beginning of October, to the beginning of December. So they would meet in all of that, and then after the session would end, the paridi and the bishops involved in the commissions would send letters and like phone calls and like a flurry of activity working for to get ready for the next session. So they were always working in between, but it was really, 3 months or so of sort of intense work. Yeah.
And were all the bishops there, or just select?
Yeah, so they would have, the opening sessions would have virtually all of the bishops at those. Like each session would have sort of its opening ceremony and that sort of thing. And then day by day, they would gather for, I'm going to forget all of the words, but they would gather in the morning for the celebration of the Eucharist, a profession of faith. They would recite the creed together. Then they would break into their committees and do their committee work. And then at some point they would have a plenary session where people were able to give speeches and things like that on the topic of the day, and provide feedback. And then as the committee is drafting things, they're sending their drafts. I mean, sometimes it's paragraph by paragraph, sometimes sentence by sentence. They're sharing what they've been writing with the other council fathers and eliciting their comments. So it was a pretty painstaking process. Difficult for sure. It's a good question. Yeah.
Was Pope Paul VI an Italian pope?
Yes, Pope Paul VI was from Milan. Yep, or he was Archbishop of Milan, yeah.
So then what was the percentage of people at this conference that were mostly Italian?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't know the exact numbers. I know that the Italians, the Curia, the Vatican bureaucracy, those offices, were almost across the board Italians. When you broke it open to the worldwide bishops, the Italians were not the majority anymore, of course, but they were a large block. But I think it's maybe more important is that just the European bishops or people of European origin, because a lot of the mission countries did not yet have native bishops. So there was that aspect as well. Yeah, good question.
So is there pushback because of that now?
Because it was overly European or something like that? Well, I think that, there might be. I think that by and large, by the end of the council, the sort of, and we'll see this when we talk about Sacrosanctum Concilium, that the sort of European focus of it all was breaking up a little bit. And so we'll see that their efforts and reforms that Sacrosanctum Concilium spells out, that mission territories in particular, but other places possibly, need to start embracing local culture and custom in the celebration of the...
So do you think there's some pushback with the present Pope along that same line?
Oh, that Pope Francis is sort of pushing back against Eurocentric? I think to a certain extent his election sort of represents a shift of the church from a primarily European, or Western anyway, Western body to a global body. If you think about like the growth of Catholicism in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of the 20th century, it's it's like, I'm making up this number, like 500% from 1910 to 2010. That's going to have that had an effect in the election of Francis. I'm sure it's going to have an effect in the next conclave, whenever that will be, just simply because of numbers. I mean, in Europe, the church is, in the United States, in Europe, the church is numerically on the decline, except when we have people coming in from outside, through migration, while in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, it's growing. So I think it's inevitable that it's going to have an effect. Yeah. Other questions? No other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious about the whole logistics, the housing, the feeding. I mean, was there a whole huge dollar amount to that?
Yes, I don't know the dollar amount, but I know that the Vatican was financially crippled as a result of the Second Vatican Council. Because I think they tried as much as possible to get bishops, and particularly from wealthier nations, Catholics, to bankroll this. But there just wasn't, just altering St. Peter's and all of the work, all that labor that went into putting up, they basically had to put up like grandstands in St. Peter's so they could get all of the bishops in there. All of that was incredibly costly. And it wasn't like the Vatican itself had a great deal of money in the first place. So yeah, it was very, very costly for the Vatican. Yeah, good question. In fact, I'll even look that one up. Other questions? No other questions. So you have time to meet with your small group. Let me just double check. You have a few questions if you have St. Therese small group ministry. So I think it's in your, it's in your binder. Small group breakout for this introductory session. You can discuss a little bit about what you're hoping for and stuff. And yeah, we good? Oh yeah, next time you really, really want chapter 3. Introduction, chapter 1 and 2 will kind of give Britain's sort of big setup. He'll repeat some of the terminology. He'll talk a little bit about where he's coming from. But chapter 3 is really going to be the big focus. Okay? Sound good? You can go. You don't need me anymore. Go ahead. So you're meeting out there. Their small groups have numbers and circles of chairs and things. Thank you. We'll see you in a couple weeks.